For most of the 1930s, across the villages of southern China, terrified peasants whispered about a new force sweeping the mountains. They called it Zhu Mao, 2 syllables, and many of them believed it was a single man, one bandit general with an impossible reach appearing in a dozen provinces at once. It wasn't one man, it was two, Zhu and Mao, and history did something strange with that name. It kept the second half and quietly erased the first. Today, the largest army on Earth, the People's Liberation Army, celebrates its birthday on the 1st of August. Statues, parades, and anthem. Ask most people and they'll tell you it was born in a glorious victory led by the founders of modern China. It was born in a defeat so total that within 10 weeks the army had almost ceased to exist. 20,000 men had risen, a few hundred were left, and the man who kept those few hundred from vanishing into the hills, the man who turned a broken remnant into the backbone of an army that would one day rule a fifth of humanity, was not Mao Zedong. It was the other syllable. And to understand him, you have to understand something almost nobody tells you. Before he was a revolutionary, he was exactly the kind of man his revolution existed to destroy. The story you've probably absorbed goes like this. Mao Zedong, the peasant genius, willed the Chinese Revolution into being through sheer force of ideas. He founded the Red Army, outsmarted his enemies, and in 1949 stood atop the gate in Beijing and declared that China had stood up. Everyone else was just an instrument of his vision. Zhu De in that story is a footnote, the military guy, the sidekick whose name faded. That story isn't a lie, it's a compression. And like most compressions, it deletes the exact part where the outcome was decided. Because the revolution didn't begin with a genius executing a plan, it began with a catastrophe, and a man who should never have survived to matter. Zhu De was born in 1886 into a poor tenant farming family in the hills of Sichuan. The kind of family that scraped together its money to send one boy to school, praying he'd lift the rest out of the dirt. He became a soldier in the dying days of the Chinese Empire. He fought in the revolution of 1911 that toppled the last dynasty. And then he watched that revolution rot into the warlord era, a generation in which China had no real government, only armies, and the men who owned the armies owned the land. Zhu did what talented soldiers did in that world. He rose. By his 30s, he was a brigade commander. Wealthy, powerful. He had a mansion, concubines, and the comfort of a man who had won. He also had an opium habit that was slowly killing him. This is the part the official histories sanded smooth, and it's the most important part of all. Because around 1920 and 1921, this successful warlord looked at his own life, the private army, the opium, the endless, meaningless fighting between generals who stood for nothing, and he was disgusted by it. He had climbed to the very top of the warlord ladder and found only more mud at the summit. So he did something almost no one in that world ever did. He walked away, he broke the opium addiction, he surrendered the command, the wealth, the safety, and he went looking for a cause worth his discipline. He tried to join the Young Communist Party. And by the traditional account, its leader turned him away. A warlord, an opium man, a relic of the old order, useless to a revolution of workers and students. Zhu didn't stop. He sailed to Europe. And in Berlin, in 1922, he found a young organizer named Zhou Enlai, who looked at this former general and saw not a relic, but a weapon. Zhou personally sponsored his entry into the party. Hold on to that because it's the hidden key to everything. The communists had just acquired the one thing they most desperately lacked. A man who understood armies from the inside, how to raise them, feed them, hold them together when they were losing, and who had already proven he would not use that power to crown himself. He'd had the chance, he handed it back. In a country being devoured by generals who became tyrants, Zhu De was the anti-warlord. Remember that. Very soon it will decide the fate of a nation. By 1927, the communists weren't fighting a distant enemy. They were fighting a partner who had just turned on them. Their uneasy ally, the nationalist commander Chiang Kai-shek, decided his communist allies were a threat to be exterminated. And he exterminated them. Across China, they were hunted and killed by the thousands. Cornered and desperate, the survivors made a decision born of pure desperation. If they were going to die anyway, they would seize a city, capture an army, and start a revolution of their own. The city was Nanchang. The date was the 1st of August, 1927, the date now carved onto the birthday of the People's Liberation Army. They took the city, and then everything fell apart. The plan required marching that captured force hundreds of kilometers south through brutal summer heat toward the coast. Disease and desertion melted the army as it walked, and at the end of the march, superior nationalist forces caught what was left and shattered it. The uprising that supposedly founded the largest army on earth ended in total defeat. The leaders scattered, the force dissolved. It should have been a footnote. One more failed rising in a terrible year, except that in the wreckage of the retreat, a few hundred beaten men were still moving, and the senior commander left among them was the former warlord from Sichuan. What he did next is the moment the parades refused to remember. By late 1927, of the more than 20,000 who had risen, Zhu commanded a remnant collapsed to roughly 800 exhausted, starving, defeated men. His officers were arguing about whether to simply give up, to scatter, to disappear, to save their own lives. There was no base, no supply, no cause anyone could still see. The rational, obvious, sensible decision was to stop. Zhu refused to stop. He gathered the broken force and told them, in effect, yes, we are defeated. Yes, this is the darkest hour. But every revolution has its darkest hour, and the ones who survive it are the ones who win in the end. He reminded them of Russia's failed uprising of 1905, the defeat that became the rehearsal for the triumph of 1917. Stay, he told them, keep the core alive, the tide will turn, and enough of them stayed. Understand what this was. Nothing was won, no battle. This was a man refusing to let an army die, talking a few hundred beaten soldiers out of quitting, then keeping them alive through the winter by negotiating shelter from an old military contact, a warlord who still trusted him from the life he'd renounced. He used the relationships of the life he'd thrown away to protect the men of the life he'd chosen. That handful of survivors, the professionals who actually knew how to fight, became the true seed of the Red Army, not the 20,000 who rose. The 800 who didn't quit. The army wasn't born on a battlefield, it was saved on a retreat. And now watch what he did with those 800. While Zhu held his remnant together in the south, another failed uprising had produced another fugitive with a small band of followers hiding in a remote mountain stronghold called Jinggangshan. That fugitive was Mao Zedong. At this point, not a god on a billion posters, but a mid-ranking organizer whose own peasant revolt had also just collapsed. In the spring of 1928, Zhu marched his survivors up the mountain and joined Mao, and the two forces fused into something new. This is the marriage that made modern China. Mao brought the theory, the radical insight that in a peasant country the revolution would be won not in the cities but in the countryside, one village at a time. Zhu brought the army, the professional skill to turn armed peasants into a force that could actually win. Together they wrote a doctrine that would humiliate armies 10 times their size for the next 20 years. It reads almost like a nursery rhyme. The enemy advances, we retreat. The enemy camps, we harass. The enemy tires, we attack. The enemy retreats, we pursue. That is Zhu's military instinct and Mao's political patience fused into a single method. And Zhu's tactics were as cunning as they were simple. His troops had no factories, so he built his plans around stealing from the enemy, turning every captured supply train into fresh weapons. His soldiers joked that the enemy was their quartermaster, delivering ammunition to their door. His men melted into the farming villages, dressed as peasants, working the fields, then striking from the crops without warning. You could not tell the soldier from the farmer until it was too late. This is why the peasants thought Zhu Mao was one man. On the ground they were. You could not tell where the general ended and the political mind began, but a fusion that complete hides a dangerous question. When two men share one name and the stakes become national, who in the end is truly in charge? For years, that question stayed politely unanswered. Until on a frozen mountain road in 1935, it had to be answered. And Zhu De answered it in a way almost no one saw coming. By 1934, the communist base had been encircled and crushed, and they were running for their lives on the retreat we now call the Long March, a year-long flight across some of the harshest terrain on Earth, in which most of those who set out would die. But buried inside that epic is a power struggle that mattered more than any mountain. As the columns fled west, Mao's battered force, perhaps 10,000 survivors, met a much larger communist army under a rival leader named Zhang Guotao. Zhang commanded around 80,000 men. Do the math that Zhang did. 8 times the troops, a claim to seniority older than Mao's, and a ragged, shrinking rival who looked finished. Zhang decided that he should lead the revolution, and the party teetered on the edge of splitting in two, in the wilderness, with the enemy closing in. Now here is the detail almost no one emphasizes. When the armies divided their columns to cross the terrain, Zhu De, the commander-in-chief, the Zhu in Zhu Mao, was traveling with Zhang's larger force. He was, effectively, in Zhang's hands, and Zhang understood exactly what Zhu was worth. Zhu was the most respected soldier in the entire movement. If he denounced Mao and threw his prestige behind Zhang, Mao was finished. So Zhang pressured him, isolated him, by some accounts threatened and humiliated him. To renounce Mao and bless the split, Zhu De refused. Again and again, alone in the rival camp, cut off, with the larger army and all the momentum against him, he would not betray the man he'd merged his army with on that mountain 7 years before. And without Zhu's blessing, Zhang's breakaway had soldiers, but no legitimacy. An army with no soul. Think about what that was. Not a battle. Zhu won nothing on any field. He simply would not say a single sentence. And that refusal, quiet and stubborn, from inside the enemy tent, starved a rival power grab of the one thing it needed to live. Military victory did not decide who would lead China. Loyalty did. Zhang's breakaway collapsed. Zhang himself would later defect to the nationalists, and the party reunited, with Mao at its head. The man history remembers as the sole architect of that triumph was Mao. But at the single moment his leadership could most easily have been destroyed, the person holding the outcome in his hands was Zhu De, and he held it by doing nothing at all except staying loyal. Now trace the line forward. Because Zhu wouldn't break, the party arrived in the north united under Mao instead of shattered. Because it was united, it survived the war with Japan. Because it survived intact and disciplined, it won the civil war that followed. And in 1949, it took China. But the deepest consequence isn't the victory, it's the shape of the thing that won. Out of these years came the founding rule of Chinese communist power, so central it's practically the constitution of the state. The party commands the gun, and the gun must never command the party. And that rule was written in flesh by the one general with the most power and the most reason to break it, who never did. To see how much it mattered, subtract him. Imagine Zhu lets his 800 survivors disband in 1927. There's no professional corps to bring to the mountain. Mao's peasant band has vision but no spine, and it's crushed like all the others. Or imagine that in 1935, exhausted, he makes the pragmatic choice and sides with the leader who has 80,000 men instead of 10,000. Zhang leads the party. Mao becomes a footnote. The entire 20th century rewrites from one spoken sentence. Or imagine the simplest thing of all, that Zhu had done what talented Chinese generals always did and made himself a warlord. We don't have to imagine it. We have the model, and his name was Yuan Shikai, the general who a decade earlier had inherited the young Chinese Republic and simply crowned himself. That was the default. That was what men with armies did. And it had turned China into a graveyard of failed governments. Zhu De had walked to the end of that road and turned around. The very warlord past that made the party reject him is what made him the one general immune to becoming a warlord. So how does it end for the man who saved the army, held the party together, and modeled its founding rule? He ends it as furniture. After 1949, his role became largely ceremonial. In 1955, when the People's Republic named its 10 marshals, its highest military honor, Zhu De was ranked first, number 1. And it meant in daily power almost nothing. Real authority flowed to others, above all to Mao. During the Cultural Revolution, this old marshal was even attacked by young radicals as a relic, and survived more by the protection of others than by any power of his own. And here is the final inversion, the one that reframes everything. that ending is not a tragedy. It is the entire point. A revolution that produces a general who insists on being remembered, who turns his army toward the capital, is a revolution that devours itself. Zhu Di's willingness to fade, to command everything, and claim nothing, to be the first marshal and the least powerful man in the room, was not weakness. It was the design working exactly as intended. He was the soldier who could have been Napoleon and chose to be a portrait on the wall. And when the end came, it came for all of them at once. Zhu Di, Mao Zedong, and Zhou Enlai, the muscle, the mind, and the diplomat, the three men who built modern China, all died in the same year, 1976. The founding generation went out together, as if the story itself had decided to end. So let's go back to where we started, to the villages and the two-syllable name and the peasants who thought Zhu Mao was one man. History corrected them. It decided Zhu Mao was one man after all, and that his name was Mao. But now you know the shape of what got erased. The army with an August birthday was not born in victory. It was saved from a defeat weeks later by a former warlord who wouldn't let 800 beaten men quit. The leadership Mao is remembered for seizing was preserved at its most fragile moment by a general in a rival camp who simply refused to betray him. This story isn't really about marches or marshals. It's about the rarest thing in all the machinery of power, a man who could seize it and chose instead to serve it. Mao famously said that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. Zhu De is the reason the gun never turned around.